The morning started like any other at Buckingham Palace. Officer David Thompson adjusted his red uniform and checked his watch. He had been protecting the royal family for 12 years, and nothing ever surprised him anymore. The tourists took their photos. The ceremony went perfectly, and everyone went home happy. David stood at his post near the main entrance, watching the crowds gather for the changing of the guard. His black boots shined in the sunlight, and his tall black hat sat perfectly straight on his head. Children pointed at him excitedly while their parents snapped pictures. He remained perfectly still, just as he had been trained to do. But today felt different somehow. There was tension in the air that David couldn't quite explain. The other guards seemed nervous, whispering to each other when they thought no one was looking. Even the palace staff moved with unusual urgency, their faces serious and worried. Around noon, David noticed several black cars pulling up to the side entrance. Men in dark suits got out, their faces grim and professional. They moved like police officers, but something about them seemed more serious, more dangerous. David's training kicked in, and he found himself paying closer attention to everything around him. One of the men in suits walked toward David's position. The man was tall and thin, with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He carried a briefcase and walked with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. As he got closer, David could see a badge hanging from his belt. "Officer Thompson," the man said in a clipped official voice. "I'm Inspector Harrison from Scotland Yard. I need you to come with me immediately." David's heart began to race, but his face remained calm and professional. In 12 years of service, he had never been called away from his post during duty hours. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't imagine what it could be. "Sir, I'm on duty until 6 o'clock, David replied, keeping his voice steady. "Perhaps you could speak with my commanding officer first." Inspector Harrison stepped closer, lowering his voice so the nearby tourists couldn't hear. "Officer Thompson, you are under arrest for treason against the crown. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in court." The words hit David like a physical blow. Treason, it was impossible. He had dedicated his entire adult life to serving and protecting the royal family. He would rather die than betray them. There had to be some terrible mistake. The inspector gestured to two other officers who had been standing nearby. They moved forward quickly, their hands resting on their weapons. David looked around desperately, hoping to see a familiar face, someone who could explain what was happening. But the other guards were looking away, avoiding his eyes. Even his closest friend, Officer Williams, turned his back when David tried to catch his attention. It was as if David had suddenly become invisible, or worse, as if he had already been erased from their lives. "There's been a mistake," David said, his voice growing louder despite his training. "I've never done anything wrong. I've served faithfully for 12 years. Ask anyone here." Inspector Harrison pulled out a pair of handcuffs, the metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Save it for the judge, Thompson. We have evidence. Lots of it." David's mind raced as he tried to think of what evidence they could possibly have. He had never stolen anything, never shared confidential information, never done anything that could be considered treasonous. His record was spotless. He had even received commendations for his service. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, David felt his world crumbling around him. The tourists were starting to notice the commotion, pointing and taking pictures with their phones. Tomorrow, his arrest would probably be all over the internet and the newspapers. The inspector began leading him toward one of the black cars, but David's legs felt weak and unsteady. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. Soon he would wake up in his small apartment, get dressed in his uniform, and report for another normal day of duty. But the handcuffs were real, cold and tight around his wrists. The inspector's grip on his arm was firm and unforgiving. The stares of the crowd were real too, filled with shock and confusion. As they reached the car, David turned back to look at the palace one last time. The building that had been his second home for over a decade now seemed foreign and threatening. The windows looked like dark eyes watching his humiliation. "Get in," Inspector Harrison ordered, opening the back door of the car. David hesitated for just a moment, looking up at the palace walls. Somewhere inside those walls, the royal family was going about their daily business, probably unaware that one of their most loyal protectors was being arrested for crimes he didn't commit. He thought about his father, who had died when David was young but had always taught him to stand up for what was right. He thought about his mother, who would be devastated when she heard the news. Most of all, he thought about the oath he had taken 12 years ago to protect and serve the crown with his life. That oath still meant everything to him, even now. Even as he was being arrested for supposedly breaking it. The police station felt cold and unfriendly as David was led through its corridors. His red uniform, which had always made him feel proud and important, now felt like a costume from another life. The other officers in the station stared at him with suspicion and disgust, as if he were already guilty of the worst possible crimes. Inspector Harrison pushed David into a small interrogation room with gray walls and a single table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across everything. David had seen rooms like this in movies, but he never imagined he would be sitting in one as a suspect. "Sit down, Thompson," Harrison ordered, pointing to a metal chair. "We're going to have a long talk." David sat down carefully, the handcuffs making it difficult to move comfortably. His mind was still reeling from everything that had happened. Just hours ago, he had been standing proudly at his post, protecting the royal family. Now he was being treated like a common criminal. Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder filled with papers and photographs. He spread them across the table like a dealer laying out cards, each one apparently containing evidence of David's supposed crimes. "Let's start with these," Harrison said, sliding a photograph across the table. "Do you recognize this man?" David looked at the photo and saw a face he didn't recognize. The man was middle-aged with dark hair and a beard, standing outside what looked like a coffee shop. David had never seen him before in his life. "No," David said honestly, "I've never seen this person before." Harrison smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who thought they were much smarter than everyone else in the room. "Really? Because our surveillance shows you meeting with this man at least 6 times over the past 3 months?" David's jaw dropped. "That's impossible. I don't know who this is." "His name is Viktor Petrov," Harrison continued, sliding another photograph across the table. "He's a known foreign agent who has been trying to gather information about royal security procedures." The second photograph showed the same man talking to someone whose back was turned to the camera. The person was wearing what looked like a royal guard uniform, but David couldn't see the face clearly. "This isn't me," David said firmly. "I've never met this man, and I've certainly never given anyone information about security procedures." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying David's face carefully. "We have bank records showing large deposits into your account. Deposits that coincide exactly with your alleged meetings with Petrov." David felt his heart sink. "What deposits?" "I barely have enough money to pay my rent each month." The inspector pulled out several bank statements and spread them on the table. David could see his name and account number at the top, but the numbers made no sense. According to these statements, someone had deposited thousands of pounds into his account over the past few months. "This is wrong," David said, his voice rising. "These aren't my real bank statements. Someone has faked these." "Are you saying Scotland Yard fabricated evidence?" Harrison asked, his voice dangerously quiet. David realized he was walking into a trap, but he didn't know how to avoid it. Everything seemed designed to make him look guilty, even when he told the truth. "I'm saying someone else did this," David replied carefully. "Someone who wanted to frame me." Harrison gathered up the papers and photographs, shuffling them like a deck of cards. "We also have testimony from other palace staff members who say you've been asking unusual questions about security protocols and royal schedules." "What staff members?" David demanded. "I want to know who said that." "I'm afraid that's classified information," Harrison replied smoothly. "But I can tell you that multiple witnesses have come forward." David felt like he was drowning. Every piece of evidence seemed to point to his guilt, but he knew he was innocent. Someone had gone to enormous trouble to make him look like a traitor, but he couldn't imagine who would do such a thing or why. "I want a lawyer," David said finally. "I'm not saying another word until I have legal representation." Harrison chuckled and shook his head. "This is a matter of national security, Thompson. The usual rules don't apply here. We can hold you for questioning for as long as necessary." The door to the interrogation room opened and another officer entered. This one was younger, with red hair and freckles, but his expression was just as serious as Harrison's. "Sir," the young officer said, "we have the results from the search of his apartment." David's blood ran cold. "You searched my apartment?" "You had no right to do that without a warrant." Actually, we did, Harrison said, pulling a piece of paper from his briefcase. Signed by a judge this morning. The young officer handed Harrison a clear plastic bag containing what looked like a small electronic device. David had never seen it before, but Harrison held it up as if it were the most damning evidence imaginable. "Do you know what this is, Thompson?" Harrison asked. "No," David replied honestly. "It's a sophisticated recording device hidden in your bedroom closet. The kind used by professional spies to record conversations and transmit them to foreign handlers." David stared at the device in disbelief. "I've never seen that before in my life. Someone must have planted it there." "Just like someone planted the bank deposits and arranged the meetings with Petrov?" Harrison asked sarcastically. "You're asking us to believe in an awful lot of coincidences." The walls of the small room seemed to be closing in on David. Every denial he made sounded weaker than the last, even to his own ears. Someone had planned this very carefully, creating a web of false evidence that would be almost impossible to escape. But David knew the truth. Even if no one else believed him, he was innocent, and somehow he had to find a way to prove it. Hours passed in the gray interrogation room. David's throat was dry and his wrists ached from the handcuffs, but Inspector Harrison showed no signs of stopping. The questions kept coming, each one designed to trap David in a contradiction or force him to admit guilt. "Let's go over your schedule again," Harrison said for the fourth time. "Tuesday, October 3rd. Where were you between 2 and 4 in the afternoon?" David closed his eyes, trying to remember. "The days all blended together when you worked the same schedule week after week?" "I was on duty at the palace, same as always." "But you took a break at 3:15, Harrison pointed out, consulting his notes. "Where did you go during that break?" "Probably to get coffee from the staff room," David replied wearily. "I always take my afternoon break at the same time." Harrison slid another photograph across the table. This one showed a coffee shop exterior with a timestamp reading 3:22 p.m. on October 3rd. "This coffee shop is 6 blocks from the palace. How do you explain being there when you said you were in the staff room?" David looked at the photograph in confusion. He could see a figure entering the coffee shop, but it was taken from too far away to make out any details clearly. "That's not me. I was never at that coffee shop." "The timestamp matches exactly with your break time," Harrison pressed. "And our witnesses say you were asking about royal schedules that same week." "What witnesses?" David demanded again. "I have a right to know who's accusing me." The door opened again, and David's heart leaped when he saw who walked in. It was Captain Morrison, his commanding officer at the palace. Morrison was a tall, stern man who had always been fair with his guards. Surely he would vouch for David's character and help clear up this terrible mistake. "Captain," David said hopefully, "thank God you're here. Please tell them this is all wrong. You know I would never betray the crown." But Captain Morrison's expression was cold and distant. He looked at David as if he were looking at a stranger, or worse, as if he were looking at something disgusting that needed to be disposed of. "Officer Thompson," Morrison said formally, "I'm here to inform you that you have been dismissed from the Royal Guard effective immediately. Your security clearance has been revoked and you are banned from palace grounds permanently." The words hit David harder than any physical blow could have. The Royal Guard wasn't just his job. It was his identity, his purpose, his entire life. He had dreamed of serving the crown since he was a boy, and now that dream was being ripped away from him. "Captain, please," David said, his voice breaking. "You've known me for 12 years. You know I'm loyal. You know I would never do anything to harm the royal family." Morrison's jaw tightened, but his expression didn't soften. "I thought I knew you, Thompson. But the evidence speaks for itself. You've betrayed everything we stand for." "What evidence?" David shouted, losing control of his emotions for the first time. "Fake bank statements? Photographs that could be anyone? Mysterious witnesses who won't show their faces? This is all a setup, and you know it." Morrison turned to Inspector Harrison. "Has he confessed yet?" "He's still maintaining his innocence," Harrison replied. "But we have more than enough evidence to proceed with charges." Morrison nodded grimly. "The royal family has been informed of the situation. They're shocked and disappointed, as you can imagine. 12 years of trust thrown away for money." David felt tears stinging his eyes, but he blinked them back. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break down completely. "I never took any money. I never met with any foreign agents. I never betrayed anyone. The Queen herself asked me to tell you how deeply hurt she is by your actions," Morrison continued, his voice like ice. "She said she had personally noticed your dedicated service over the years, which makes your betrayal even more painful." Those words cut deeper than anything else. David had always hoped that his service had been noticed and appreciated by the royal family. To learn that the Queen had indeed noticed him, but now thought he had betrayed her trust, was almost unbearable. "Captain, I swear on my father's grave I am innocent," David said desperately. "Someone has gone to enormous trouble to frame me, but I don't know who or why." Morrison finally looked directly at David, and for just a moment, his stern expression seemed to waver. But then he shook his head and turned away. "I'm sorry, Thompson. I really am. But the evidence is overwhelming." As Morrison left the room, David felt the last of his hope draining away. If his own commanding officer, a man who had known him for over a decade, believed he was guilty, then who would believe his protestations of innocence? Harrison gathered up his papers again, a satisfied look on his face. "I think we're done here for today, Thompson. You'll be transferred to a holding cell while we prepare the formal charges." "What charges?" David asked numbly. "Treason, espionage, violation of the Official Secrets Act." Harrison listed casually. "You're looking at life in prison, assuming they don't bring back the death penalty for cases like yours." 2 guards entered the room to escort David to his cell. As they led him through the corridors of the police station, David felt like he was walking through a nightmare. Every step took him further away from his old life, and closer to a future that seemed hopeless and dark. The holding cell was small and damp, with a narrow bench along one wall and a tiny window set high up near the ceiling. David sat down heavily, still wearing his red uniform, though it no longer felt like a symbol of honor and duty. He thought about his mother, who would soon hear about his arrest on the news. He thought about his colleagues at the palace who now believed he was a traitor. Most of all, he thought about the royal family, who trusted him to protect them and now thought he had sold them out for money. But as David sat in that cold cell, one thought kept nagging at him. Someone had planned this very carefully, creating false evidence and fake witnesses. But why? What could anyone gain by destroying his life and making him look like a traitor? The answer to that question might be the key to proving his innocence if he could just figure out what it was. 3 days later, Sarah returned to visit David with news that made his blood run cold. She looked tired and worried, her usually neat appearance slightly disheveled, as if she hadn't been sleeping well. "I'm afraid I have some disturbing information," she said, settling into her chair across from David. "My investigation has uncovered something that makes this case much more complicated than we initially thought." David felt his stomach clench. "What do you mean?" Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been looking into the backgrounds of everyone who had access to your personal information and work schedule. What I found is deeply troubling." She spread several photographs across the table, along with official-looking documents. "Do you remember Officer Bradley, the man you mentioned who was jealous of your promotions?" "Of course," David said. "But I told you I can't believe James would do something like this." "I'm afraid you might be wrong about that." Sarah pointed to one of the documents. "James Bradley has been having serious financial problems for the past 2 years. His wife left him and took half his assets in the divorce. He's been gambling heavily, trying to make up the losses." David stared at the financial records Sarah had obtained. The numbers showed a man spiraling into debt, with credit cards maxed out and loans he couldn't possibly repay on a guard's salary. "But that doesn't prove he framed me," David said, though doubt was beginning to creep into his voice. "There's more." Sarah pulled out another set of documents. "I managed to trace the source of those cash deposits made to your account. They all came from the same bank, and the withdrawal records show they were taken from an account belonging to a shell company." "A shell company?" "A fake business set up to hide the real source of money. And guess who has been making regular deposits into that shell company's account?" Sarah slid another bank record across the table. David looked at the signature on the deposit slips and felt his world shift again. The handwriting was familiar, though he had only seen it on duty rosters and official reports. It was James Bradley's signature. "This still doesn't make complete sense," David said, trying to process the information. "Even if James needed money, why would someone pay him to frame me specifically?" Sarah's expression grew even more serious. "That's where this gets truly frightening. I believe Officer Bradley has been recruited by foreign agents, and you were chosen as a target because of your exemplary record and high security clearance. She pulled out a surveillance photograph that David hadn't seen before. It showed James Bradley sitting at a cafe table with a man David didn't recognize. The man had dark hair and expensive clothes, and something about his posture suggested he was used to being in control. This photograph was taken 6 months ago by MI5, though they didn't realize its significance at the time. The man Bradley is meeting with is Anton Kozlov, a Russian intelligence operative who's been operating in London under diplomatic cover. David felt like the ground was falling away beneath him. You're saying this is about Russian spies? It appears so. My theory is that Kozlov recruited Bradley to provide inside information about palace security. But Bradley's gambling debts and erratic behavior made him an unreliable asset, so they decided to frame someone else. Someone with an impeccable record who could be positioned as a more credible spy. They used Bradley to set me up, David said, the pieces finally clicking into place exactly. Bradley had access to your locker, your schedule, your personal information. He could have easily planted the recording device in your apartment and arranged for the fake bank deposits. The surveillance photos showing someone in a guard uniform meeting with Petrov could have been Bradley himself, dressed to look like you from a distance. David's hands clenched into fists. The betrayal by a colleague was almost as painful as the original false accusations. So Bradley gets paid by the Russians and I take the fall for treason. I believe that was the plan, yes. But there's a problem. Sarah's expression grew worried. Bradley disappeared 2 days ago. He didn't show up for his shift at the palace, and his landlord says he packed up his apartment in the middle of the night. He's gone? It gets worse. Anton Kozlov left the country yesterday on a diplomatic flight back to Moscow, and the shell company account has been emptied and closed. David realized what this meant. They're covering their tracks. Eliminating the evidence, I'm afraid so. And without Bradley's testimony or access to Kozlov, it's going to be much harder to prove that you were framed. The hope that David had been feeling for the past few days began to evaporate. Even with Sarah's discoveries, he was still sitting in jail while the real criminals had escaped justice. But we do have one advantage, Sarah continued. I've been in contact with MI5, and they're very interested in this case now. They've been tracking Kozlov's activities for months, and the evidence we've uncovered helps fill in some gaps in their investigation. Will they help clear my name? They want to, but they're being cautious. National security cases are always complicated, and they can't afford to make mistakes. Sarah packed her papers back into her briefcase. However, they've agreed to review all the evidence again, including the surveillance footage and the bank records. As David was led back to his cell that evening, his mind was racing with everything Sarah had told him. To know that he had been deliberately targeted and framed was both relieving and terrifying. It proved his innocence, but it also showed how carefully his enemies had planned his destruction. He thought about James Bradley, a man he had worked alongside for years, sharing coffee breaks and complaining about difficult tourists. How long had Bradley been planning this betrayal? Had he ever felt guilty about destroying an innocent man's life? But David also felt a new determination growing inside him. The truth was finally starting to come out, and with Sarah's help and MI5's investigation, maybe there was still a chance to prove his innocence and reclaim his life. He just had to hold on long enough for justice to prevail, assuming it wasn't already too late. David spent the night staring at the ceiling of his cell, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Inspector Harrison's smug face or Captain Morrison's look of disappointment. The cold concrete walls seemed to echo with the words traitor and life in prison. The next morning, a guard brought him a tray of barely edible food and told him he had a visitor. David's heart jumped with hope. Maybe it was his mother, or perhaps one of his fellow guards who believed in his innocence, anyone who might help him fight these terrible charges. But when he was led to the visiting room, he was surprised to see a woman he didn't recognize. She was in her 40s with short blonde hair and intelligent green eyes. She wore a simple blue suit and carried a leather briefcase that looked well used. "Mr. Thompson," she said, standing up as he entered, "my name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a solicitor and I've been assigned to your case." David sat down across from her, the handcuffs making it awkward to move. "I didn't request a lawyer. I thought they said I couldn't have one because this was a national security matter." Sarah smiled grimly. "Things have changed overnight. The press got hold of the story and there's been quite an uproar. The government is under pressure to ensure you receive proper legal representation." She opened her briefcase and pulled out several newspapers. David could see his photograph on the front pages. along with headlines like Royal Guard arrested for treason and Palace betrayal shocks nation. "This is a nightmare," David said, looking at the headlines. "My mother must be seeing this. My neighbors, everyone I've ever known." "I know this is difficult," Sarah said sympathetically, "but the media attention might actually work in our favor. There are already people questioning whether the evidence against you is as strong as the police claim." David looked up with the first spark of hope he'd felt since his arrest. "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled out a legal pad covered with notes. "I've had a chance to review the evidence they're using against you. While it looks damning on the surface, there are several things that don't add up." She flipped through her notes, finding the page she wanted. For instance, the bank deposits. They were all made in cash at different branches across London. But according to your work schedule, you were on duty at the palace during the times when several of these deposits were made. "So I couldn't have made them myself," David said, feeling a glimmer of hope. "Exactly. Either someone else made the deposits using your account information, or the timestamps have been falsified somehow." Sarah made another note on her pad. "Then there are the photographs allegedly showing you meeting with this Viktor Petrov character." She showed David one of the surveillance photos again. "Look at this carefully. The person in the photo is wearing a Royal Guard uniform, but can you see anything specific that would identify them as you?" David studied the image closely. The photo was taken from a distance, and the person's face was partially obscured by shadows. "No, you can't really see the face clearly. And the uniform looks generic." "Precisely. Anyone could have put on a similar uniform and arranged to be photographed near this Petrov fellow. It's not proof that you were involved." Sarah continued going through the evidence piece by piece, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps that David hadn't noticed before. For the first time since his arrest, he began to feel like someone was actually listening to him and taking his claims of innocence seriously. "What about the recording device they found in my apartment?" David asked. "That's more troublesome," Sarah admitted. "But again, if someone wanted to frame you, planting evidence in your apartment wouldn't be impossible." "Do you have any idea who might have access to your flat?" David thought carefully. "I gave a spare key to my landlord for emergencies, and there's Mrs. Peterson next door who sometimes waters my plants when I'm working long shifts." "Anyone else?" "Service workers, delivery people. Anyone who might have had an opportunity?" "Well, I had my locks changed about 6 months ago after there were some break-ins in the neighborhood. The locksmith company would have records of the new key codes." Sarah made another note. "That's worth investigating." "What about enemies? Anyone who might have a grudge against you or want to see you discredited?" David shook his head. "I can't think of anyone. I've always tried to get along with my colleagues. I don't have any ex-girlfriends who hate me or anything like that." "What about professionally? Any incidents at work? Complaints against you? Conflicts with other guards or palace staff?" "Nothing serious," David said. "There was some tension with Officer Bradley a few years ago when he thought I was being promoted ahead of him, but that was resolved." Sarah looked up from her notes with interest. "Tell me more about this Officer Bradley, James Bradley. He's been with the Royal Guard for about 15 years. He's always been ambitious, wanted to move up the ranks quickly." David paused, trying to remember the details. "He was angry when I got assigned to some of the more prestigious duties like escorting visiting dignitaries. Is he still working at the palace?" "As far as I know, yes. But I can't imagine James would go to these lengths just because of some professional jealousy." Sarah continued taking notes, asking detailed questions about David's work relationships, his daily routines, and anything unusual that had happened in the months leading up to his arrest. "There is one thing," David said slowly. "About 3 weeks ago, I noticed someone had been in my locker at the palace. Nothing was missing, but things were arranged differently than how I left them. Did you report it?" "I mentioned it to Captain Morrison, but he said it was probably just the cleaning staff. I didn't think much of it at the time." Sarah underlined something in her notes. "That could be significant. If someone was planting evidence or gathering information about you, they might have needed access to your personal belongings." As their meeting continued, David began to feel like he wasn't completely alone in this fight. Sarah was professional and thorough, and she seemed genuinely committed to proving his innocence. "What happens next?" David asked as their time was running out. "I'm going to start investigating all of these inconsistencies," Sarah said, packing up her briefcase. "I'm also going to request all the surveillance footage from the areas where you allegedly met with Petrov. If you're innocent, as I believe you are, then the real evidence will support that." As David was led back to his cell, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his arrest. Hope. Maybe there was a way out of this nightmare after all. 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. David had been moved to a different facility while awaiting trial, and the media attention around his case had only intensified. Every day brought new headlines speculating about royal security breaches and foreign spy networks operating in London. Sarah visited him regularly, updating him on the investigation's progress, but the news was often frustrating. MI5 was being thorough but cautious, unwilling to make any public statements until they had completed their own internal review. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning, everything changed. David was in the exercise yard when a guard approached him with an urgent expression. "Thompson, you've got visitors. Important ones. You need to come with me right now." David was led to a different visiting room than usual, one that was larger and more secure. When the door opened, he was shocked to see not just Sarah but also a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with unmistakable authority. "Mr. Thompson," the man said, standing as David entered. "I'm Sir Richard Pemberton, director of MI5. I believe we need to talk." David's heart raced as he sat down. The head of MI5 wouldn't visit unless something major had happened. "Sir Richard has some news that I think you'll want to hear," Sarah said, barely able to contain her excitement. Sir Richard opened a briefcase and pulled out a tablet computer. "Mr. Thompson, I want to show you something that was recovered from James Bradley's apartment before he fled the country." He turned the tablet toward David, showing what appeared to be a video file. When he pressed play, David saw a familiar room that he recognized as Bradley's sitting room. The timestamp showed it was recorded just days before David's arrest. On the screen, James Bradley was talking on the phone, pacing nervously around his apartment. The audio was clear enough to hear his side of the conversation. "I don't like this," Bradley was saying to whoever was on the other end. "Thompson is a good man. He doesn't deserve this." There was a pause as the person on the phone responded, then Bradley continued. "I know what we agreed, but I'm having second thoughts. There has to be another way to get you the information you need." Another pause, then Bradley's voice became more agitated. "Don't threaten me. I've already done enough. The bank account, the photos, planting that device in his apartment. I'm not doing anything else." David felt his heart pounding as he listened to Bradley confessing to exactly what Sarah had theorized. But the video continued. "Fine," Bradley said angrily, "but after this we're done. I don't care how much money you're offering. I can't live with destroying an innocent man's life." The video continued for several more minutes, with Bradley becoming increasingly distressed as the conversation went on. At one point, he threw his phone across the room and sat down heavily on his couch, putting his head in his hands. Sir Richard paused the video and looked directly at David. This recording was found on a hidden camera that Bradley had apparently installed in his own apartment, presumably as insurance against his handlers. "We believe he was growing paranoid about his Russian contacts and wanted evidence in case they tried to eliminate him." "Where is Bradley now?" David asked, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "We found him 3 days ago, hiding in a safe house in Scotland," Sir Richard replied. "He's been cooperating fully with our investigation in exchange for protection and a reduced sentence." Sarah pulled out her own folder of documents. "Bradley has provided detailed information about how the entire operation was planned and executed. He's given us bank records, communication logs, and even photographs of his meetings with the Russian operatives." David felt a mixture of relief and anger washing over him. "So he's admitted that he framed me?" "Completely," Sir Richard confirmed. "He's provided sworn testimony describing exactly how he planted the evidence, falsified the bank records, and even wore a guard uniform similar to yours to create those surveillance photographs." "But why?" David asked. "Why did he choose me specifically?" Sir Richard exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. "According to Bradley, you were selected because of your exemplary record and high security clearance. The Russians wanted to recruit someone with access to sensitive information about royal protection protocols. When Bradley proved unreliable due to his gambling addiction and emotional instability, they decided to frame you as a spy while using Bradley to actually steal the information they needed. They thought that if you were arrested as a traitor, the resulting investigation would reveal security weaknesses they could exploit," Sarah added. "It was a complex plan designed to cause maximum damage to royal security while covering their tracks." David shook his head in disbelief. So they were willing to destroy my life just to create a distraction? I'm afraid so, Sir Richard said grimly. But their plan has backfired spectacularly. Bradley's cooperation has allowed us to identify and arrest several other Russian operatives who were part of this network. We've also been able to strengthen security protocols based on the information they were trying to obtain. Sir Richard closed his briefcase and stood up. Mr. Thompson, on behalf of Her Majesty's government, I want to offer you our sincere apologies for what you've endured. You are, of course, completely exonerated of all charges. The arrest warrant has been cancelled, and all evidence of these false accusations will be expunged from your record. David felt tears of relief streaming down his face. After weeks of nightmare, the truth had finally set him free. What happens now? He asked. You're free to go immediately, Sarah said, smiling broadly. Your uniform and personal effects are being returned, and Captain Morrison is waiting outside to escort you back to the palace. The palace wants me back? Sir Richard nodded. The Queen herself has requested a private audience with you tomorrow morning. I believe she has something important to say to you personally. As David was led out of the visiting room toward freedom, he felt like he was waking up from the worst nightmare of his life. But he also knew that this experience had changed him forever. He had learned painful lessons about trust, betrayal, and the lengths that enemies of his country would go to achieve their goals. Most importantly, he had learned that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of eventually coming to light. The next morning, David stood outside the private audience chamber at Buckingham Palace wearing his freshly cleaned red uniform. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tall black hat, not from nervousness about meeting the Queen, but from the overwhelming emotions of being back where he belonged. Captain Morrison stood beside him, looking genuinely remorseful. David, I owe you the biggest apology of my life, he had said earlier. I should have trusted you. I should have known that someone of your character could never commit treason. The ornate doors opened and David was announced by a palace official. He walked into the elegant room where Queen Elizabeth sat in a comfortable chair near a window, overlooking the palace gardens. The morning sunlight caught the silver in her hair, and her expression was both kind and serious. Your Majesty, David said, bowing deeply as protocol required. Officer Thompson, the Queen said, gesturing for him to stand. Please come closer. We have much to discuss. David approached, still feeling surreal about the entire situation. Just days ago, he had been a prisoner facing life imprisonment for treason. Now he was standing before the sovereign he had sworn to protect, who wanted to speak with him personally. I asked to see you privately because I wanted to personally apologize for the terrible ordeal you have endured, the Queen began. The accusations against you were not only false but represented a profound failure of the systems meant to protect our most loyal servants. Your Majesty, you have nothing to apologize for, David replied. I was honored to serve and I remain honored to serve. The Queen smiled slightly. Your loyalty, even after what you've suffered, is exactly why I wanted to speak with you myself. Sir Richard Pemberton has briefed me thoroughly on the investigation. The courage you showed in maintaining your innocence despite overwhelming evidence against you was remarkable. She paused, studying David's face carefully. But I'm told that during your interrogation, when faced with what seemed like certain conviction, you said something that puzzled the investigators. Inspector Harrison reported that when asked if you had any final words before being formally charged, you said 5 words that he found particularly memorable. David's mind raced back to that terrible moment in the interrogation room. He had been exhausted, defeated, and facing the complete destruction of everything he held dear. But he remembered now what he had said. I said, God save our gracious Queen, David replied quietly. The Queen's eyes filled with tears, though she maintained her composure. Yes, that's exactly what Inspector Harrison told me. Even when you believed your life was over, even when you thought you had been abandoned by everyone, including the crown itself, your first instinct was still to express loyalty to your sovereign. She stood up and walked to her desk, picking up an ornate wooden box. Officer Thompson, those 5 words told me everything I needed to know about your character. A man who faces his darkest hour with such grace and loyalty deserves more than just an apology. The Queen opened the box and removed a gleaming medal attached to a ribbon. David recognized it immediately as the Royal Victorian Medal, one of the highest honors that could be bestowed for exceptional service to the crown. This medal is awarded for extraordinary service and loyalty, the Queen explained. I can think of no one more deserving than a man who maintained his oath of loyalty, even when he believed that same crown had abandoned him. David felt his knees go weak as the Queen approached him with the medal. Your Majesty, I don't deserve such an honor. I was just doing my duty. Precisely, the Queen replied, pinning the medal to his uniform. Doing your duty under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. You have shown what it truly means to serve with honor. As the ceremony concluded, the Queen returned to her chair. I'm told that you're being offered a promotion to the Elite Protection Unit, with a significant increase in responsibility and compensation. Captain Morrison assures me that this scandal will not impact your career prospects in any way. I'm grateful for that opportunity, Your Majesty, David said, but honestly, I would be content just to return to my regular duties. Protecting you and your family is all I've ever wanted to do. The Queen nodded approvingly. That attitude is exactly why you're receiving this promotion, whether you want it or not. Leaders are often those who seek responsibility not for personal gain, but out of genuine dedication to service. As David prepared to leave, the Queen had one final message for him. Officer Thompson, what happened to you was a reminder that evil exists in this world and that good people sometimes suffer unjustly. But it was also a reminder that truth has a way of prevailing when good people refuse to give up fighting for it. Your solicitor, Miss Mitchell, and Sir Richard Pemberton showed the same dedication to uncovering the truth that you showed in maintaining your innocence. That gives me great hope for our future. David bowed again, feeling overwhelmed by the Queen's words and by everything that had happened. Thank you, Your Majesty. I will continue to serve with the same loyalty I've always felt, but now with an even deeper appreciation for the trust you place in us. As he left the audience chamber, David reflected on the incredible journey he had been through. He had lost everything and then regained it all, but he was not the same man who had stood at his post just weeks ago. He had learned that loyalty is not just about good times, but about maintaining your principles when everything seems lost. Walking through the palace corridors in his red uniform, wearing his new medal, David felt a profound sense of gratitude not just for his vindication, but for the reminder of what he was truly fighting to protect. The 5 words he had spoken in his darkest hour had come from his heart, and they had ultimately saved him. God save our gracious Queen, he whispered again, and this time the words carried not desperation but triumph.